late good morning to everybody. I'm Rob Mumford. I'm a project management partner at G&T. We're lucky enough to be giving you a panel conversation just before lunch. So my ears are to rumbling stomachs in the audience. So hopefully we'll kind of canter through this at pace, keep it interesting, and then obviously we'll break for lunch thereafter. So before I let the panel introduce themselves, obviously we're going to be talking about buying the stock. So obviously we're going to be covering a few kind of stages in the lead up to buying the stock. So we're going to canter through a bit of design, and obviously we're kind of cross-pollinating from some conversations that we've already had this morning. Then we're going to jump into the procurement side of things. We're going to kind of dim the lights ever so slightly, and then we're going to start talking legals and contracts. We are lucky enough. We are lucky enough to have. I think you are the only lawyer.
I always get
stood on stage. Yeah. So Adriano has left his gavel at the back of the room. So hopefully we'll behave, and then we'll do some kind of closing, kind of wrap up comments, and obviously picking up some Q&A. So John, if I can hand over to you first for an intro.
Yes, I'm John Ward. I'm Executive Director of Engineering and Technology for Robert Bird Group. I've been with RBG for 25 years, driving various structural forms around the world, but with a real interest in steel and its application, and latterly in how we deploy this fantastic material in a way which is sustainable and usable for the long term and for the good of society.
Hi everyone, my name's Laura Batty. I'm a Senior Associate at Hain Tillett Steel, a structural and civil engineers. And I run the research and innovation team. So this team kind of sits away from any sort of client-facing projects. We do sustainability focused, trying to solve unsolved challenges in structural and civil engineering.
My introduction is more mundane than that. I'm Adriano Amorese, partner at Mishcon de Reya, UK law firm, specialising in advising on procurement routes and negotiating construction contracts. So I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of projects involving reused steel and having to consider the contractual implications of that. So I'll be speaking more about that today.
Hi everyone, I'm Luke Francis. I'm an Associate Director at Mace and Commercial Lead on the Jermyn Street Piccadilly project, which understands one of the biggest steel reuse projects in the country at the moment.
Good stuff. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Pleasure to be sat with you all. So we're going to jump into the design side of things, and you know there has been obviously conversations this morning about this. So we're going to try and kind of carefully navigate and not kind of duplicate effort from conversations this morning. So with an eye on buying the stock and procurement, just thinking about the way in which design teams kind of approach design. Should we be designing to fit, reuse steel elements based on the pool of materials available, or should we? And I think somebody raised a question earlier. Should we ideally kind of continue in a highly efficient design scenario, but flip that on its head and design for steel use right from the offing, which has certainly been the sentiment this morning. So, I suppose John and Laura, I'll kind of kickstart with you guys as designers. So, John, do you want to start there?
Sure. In our experience, and I'm sure in many of your experience, the design process from initial concept design through to somebody actually putting a shovel or a piling rig in the ground is not weeks or months, but years. And if you go at concept design stage to a steel stockist and say, we'd like you to hold on to this many tons of reused steel because we think we might need them, they'll laugh at you because they're not going to keep X hundred tons of steel sitting around in a field somewhere on the off chance that you might need them in a few years' time. So I think in our experience, the design process has to be to seek the most efficient design. In the words of the instructee, use less stuff, drive design efficiency, and then when the detailed design is done, when we have the best design we can, meeting the needs, driving embodied carbon efficiency and operational efficiency of the building, then we look to see, okay, here is our design. Now, what are the opportunities to source some of this steel from reused stock? Understanding the compromises involved and making sure that we're continuing to meet the building requirements, but also being careful of the carbon cost that we pay, because there is a sustainability trade-off to the use of recycled material, reclaimed material, and that has to be considered in the shape as well. So I would say design for the best design, the most sustainable design, and then see if we can use reclaimed steel for part of that procurement stage.
And Laura, you got any further thoughts on that? I mean, you've been kind of spearheading, a number of kind of reuse kind of projects, and that's certainly kind of where you and I were introed with one another. Have you got any further thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. I think there's nothing to add, so I won't.
And just out of interest, is design for reuse predicated on steel sizes? I mean, we've talked about donor projects, and Luke, you and I have had a previous conversation about this. Having a donor site is frankly probably a nirvana state that we all probably would like to have. It's a nice thing. But if we don't, what things, early days from a design sense, should we be really kind of focusing in on?
I don't know if I agree with the donor site being the nirvana. I think the model of moving stock to a central stockholder or several central stockholders is actually more efficient use of material because you have a bigger pool to play from. So I think the donor to recipient model tells a good story, but it's not a really efficient use of material, which is a kind of a scarce material, especially as we're seeing it is quite hard to salvage steel because the incentives are not exactly there yet. But then, as John said, you can design for the most efficient stock. And then if you're drawing from a wider pool of materials, which is the central stockholder model, I think that's the most efficient route that we've kind of come across so far.
And there was a point raised, I think Will raised it previously from Lendlease about temporary works. And again, the experiences that certainly I've had on past projects has been that, we've not necessarily been quite able to kind of get over some of the hurdles that we've had with design efficiencies to bring it into the permanent scheme design. But the temporary works design is something that has opened up a kind of a world of opportunity to introduce reused steel. And obviously there's certain barriers to being able to kind of design temporary works super early on, because we've all talked about how early we need to have these conversations. So just touching on the temporary works and the kind of the perceived, pass that to the contractor piece, and Luke might get a view from you here. But how early can we go on the temporary works design and have designers sat client side wanting and pushing to explore the temporary works design before we've perhaps engaged in the market?
I think if you're in the situation where you have a load of temporary works sitting around with known characteristics, and the question is, can we reuse some of this? The answer is, yeah, absolutely, let's have a look at it. But that's, certainly in London, a very rare situation to be in. Most normally, you will have a temporary works design which has been done to meet the requirements of the contractor, and then the question is, okay, can we make any of this out of reused steel? The challenge with temporary works is it tends frequently actually to have more onerous design requirements than the permanent steel. In particular, anything which is part of a crane or crane ties, crane bases, related elements is going to have fatigue requirements, which for practical purposes mostly rules out reclaimed steel unless you have a lot more information than is typically the case. Even without that, you're looking at outdoor steel in an aggressive environment subject to impact, and therefore is having to consider a situation called brittle fracture, which is something which can be addressed technically but requires additional testing, additional documentation of the donor steel, and that's time and, being realistic, cost, which the contractor is not going to be very enthusiastic about and may not be practical. So I think it's not a hard no, but if we're looking for low-hanging fruit and the easy wins, it's actually the permanent works. And yeah, opportunistically, if we're able to do temporary works out of reclaimed steel, then great, let's go for it. But in the majority of cases, it's not something we should be actively pushing. The low-hanging fruit, the major opportunities are in the permanent works.
And Laura, just last one on design, if we may, before we kind of jump to procurement. In terms of a specific sector being perhaps more focused on reused steel, are you seeing that there's one specific sector that's perhaps, slightly further ahead than others? Obviously, as an industry, it's well on the radar and we're all thinking about it. Some projects realising it, better than others. But from a sector perspective, any focused areas that you're seeing, really ahead of the field?
I mean, I think, at least from our experience, it's been the sort of central London, usually refurb commercial sector. That's, I think, almost all the reuse of steel jobs that we've had through the door have been commercial. Yeah.
Cool.
I would agree with that as well, and I think that's driven by occupier demand, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As much as anything else. Which other sectors I don't think have to the same extent at the moment.
Okay, so let's start thinking about procurement. So we're getting into the the kind of the great big world of main contractor introductions now, Luke. You'll be getting your calculator out and getting prepared for pricing. So assuming we've kind of done everything we possibly can do, front end, with a developer, with a design team, from a contracting perspective, are there kind of particular things that you love to see or hate to see when you get kind of first, inset of it's going to be a reuse scheme, the whole kind of push on circular economy?
Yeah, so when Mace first tendered for the project, GPE, who the client, have got a donor building, and from the outset, the design was that we're going to take the steel out of this building, we're going to reuse as much as we can in German Street, Piccadilly. What that enabled is that the design was around the steels that were coming out of the old building. So when we tendered, we tendered based on the stage 2 information, which had in its infancy, but a model that showed some of that or most of that steel being reused. That meant that it was built into the cost plan, it was built into the program, it was always a part of the strategy. So we've been involved in the project for just over a year now on a PCSA basis. We've got William Hare on board. They're working through with Elliott Wood and EMR, working through that model to maximise the amount of steel that we're able to reuse. We're up to around sort of 75%-ish. And I think having the experts on board has enabled us to increase that. And where we've realised that we can't use certain sections that have come out of the donor project, William Hare have engaged Cleveland Steel. So we've been able to supplement that further to increase it. But I think having the specialists on board at the right time, having the risk allocated to the right people at the right time, has enabled that process to bear fruit, I think.
And out of interest, the donor site piece, had you not had the donor site, do you think that kind of rate of reuse would be where it is now or not?
Well, I think because the building was designed around the members that were coming out of the old building, I think you probably would struggle to achieve that. And it opens a question of, okay, at what point do you ask the question, we've got this design, how much steel can we reuse? And I think doing that earlier is better, but we had that donor project, so we were able to do that earlier. When do you do it? If you don't have that donor project, I think that does bring in risk, especially when you're entering into sort of main contract stage and you're making commitments on how much steel you're reusing when actually you can't commit to it at that point, depending on what you know.
Mm. And on the PCSA point for the project, the Piccadilly or German Street, project that you mentioned, how soon? What's your Nirvana state with regards to kind of the procurement exercise and undertaking the PCSA? Again, we've kind of talked earlier on about stage 3, stage 4 design information. We obviously want the information to be as good as possible, but does there come a point from a main contracting perspective with reuse in mind where you'd rather be in earlier than perhaps later with the client's team having taken more time to kind of bring the thoughts and design to fruition?
I think the answer is the earlier the better. Mm-hmm. So the process started long before we were on board. We were engaged on a sort of first stage basis at stage 2, and then we've worked through stage 3 and stage 4 with Elliott Wood and William Hare, and that we'll be entering into contract on a stage 4 basis.
Okay.
Could it have been done on a single stage? Because 2-stage lends itself very well to this process, doesn't it? But I always wonder if it could be done on a single stage basis, or if it's really essential to have that 2-stage contracting protocol.
I think because you don't have the right information at that point in time. So if you go on a single stage basis, maybe you'd be appointed at stage 3. Mm. But even then, there was still a process to go through in order to get to that maximised amount of reuse. Yeah. So I think the model that GP have adopted is the right one for this particular project.
And again, it's making sure that we're trying to set everybody up to succeed in the process. Whereby if, you're pricing for risk, on a single stage basis because you don't know certain things, you haven't got the information. It's of no benefit to the whole project team to try and make the reuse piece succeed in its own right. So, yeah, procurement strategy is obviously a kind of a critical conversation. Thinking about the players that you engage with, Luke, on the contracting side of things. We've kind of had EMR mentioned today, Cleveland Steel. With the main contracting market and obviously the kind of the pools and material banks that we've got, what more do you think we can all collectively do to kind of bring that material bank from more of a dare I say, kind of a cottage industry to more mainstream, kind of steel use?
I think it's simple as shouting about the successes. Over the next 2 years, when we deliver this project, there will be a project on Piccadilly in central London that is 75% reused steel. And I think the more that we can shout about those successes, the more people will understand it, the more people want to do it. And then people will start asking about, okay, how can I get this building I'm demolishing back into that food chain, if you like? It will make the process easier for projects that don't have that donor site.
And sorry, just to add to that, I think we need to be realistic about the incentives of reclaiming steel from demolition sites, because it doesn't really fully exist unless there's real demand from the client. That needs to be sorted out, because otherwise we're going to use up all the good stuff, and then there won't be any reused steel to go around. So,
is that a question of growing demand then, or is it increasing the quality of the steel that's coming out of deconstructed sites?
I think it's even reflecting the value of deconstructing rather than demolishing, because it's not necessarily financial value right now. It could be sort of an embodied carbon value, but even then the person undertaking the demolition doesn't see the benefit. It's the person that's reusing the reused material that sees the benefit. So there has to be some sort of way that we can incentivize reclaiming steel.
A piece of work that we've done with EMR has been around classifying the quality of reclaimed steel stock, such that in the imagined future, the designers can say, here is my optimally designed building. These members, deflection controlled for argument's sake, we can actually get away with a lower grade of reclaimed steel, say grade C for argument's sake, whereas these columns, they're strength governed, they need to be at least grade B. And then you can see from the stocker's point of view, actually, we can sell grade B at a premium to grade C. Therefore, Mr. Demo Contractor, it's worth your effort taking more care, because actually there's a commercial value to it. And so you'd like to see getting to industrial scale where market forces dictate this. There is a value to being more careful, therefore it's worth your while. And then being able to provide clarity as to here is the stock we have at different grades. Mr. Designer, you've specified you require these grades. We can the fabricator can straight away match requirements to what's available, rather than the current process which requires somebody to sit in a field lovingly vetting each piece of steel, almost as a cottage industry, which is working at the moment. It gets us started. But I think we need to look forward to a future where we're talking about not a couple of hundred tons of steel, but tens of thousands of tons of steel, if we're actually going to make a difference to the climate.
So on that point of classification and grades of reused steel, we're slightly kind of blurring into the kind of the legals and contract side of here. But again, just coming off the back of Sir Martin Moore-Bick's Grenfell Tower inquiry report, and obviously the criticism there on construction industry, product testing and certification. Whilst I think Steve Bennett mentioned that we've been using frankly reused steel for decades, just by purpose of repurposing buildings and reusing, refurbing them. What do we think? Could there be an implication on the classification and testing of steel? I know we're coming to a testing conversation point in the moment, but thinking about how resilient we as an industry are with regards to the certification and steels and with that kind of construction product piece in mind, because essentially steel is a construction product as with anything else.
Steel as a construction product, there has been a whole discussion in the BCSC working group and elsewhere around how do you certify reclaimed steel as distinct from virgin steel, and there's quite a well-developed now discussion around how do you do this, what is it suitable for, what is the level of testing required to gain clarity, and I think we do have another discussion, so I won't trail that. But I think steel as a material, if we're talking about steel reclaimed, particularly post-1970s from buildings in the UK, we can have a reasonable level of confidence that it's been procured originally according to certain standards. It is therefore fit for purpose when it was installed. And the testing that we're doing is identification testing to a large extent. We've got this piece of steel, we're pretty sure it has these characteristics because of where it's come from, the documentation that comes with it. We're going to do a certain amount of testing just basically to say, are you absolutely sure? Yes, we are. Great. And that's where the classification becomes important, because for many uses, particularly beams where it's deflection governed, it's not strength critical. There is redundant load paths. The risk is actually of anything dreadful happening is relatively low, and you can take a view on that. If you start talking about strength governed elements, fracture critical, fatigue critical, major risk of critical failure, then you would be asking for a higher category, greater testing, greater cost. I think at some point you therefore price yourselves out of the validity of reclaimed steel, but we end up talking about quite a small portion of the total tonnage falls into that category. So I think we can focus on the low-hanging fruit, get the stuff which is non-critical, is easy to validate, get that in quantity, and then when we've got an industry shifting tens of thousands of tons of steel a year, then there'll be investment. Okay, now we've got this extra 10%. How do we go after that? But let's go after the easy stuff first.
No, good stuff. Okay, Adriano, let's kind of dive into the legals and the contract side of things.
Sure.
We've briefly skimmed on kind of risk profile and the like. From your perspective, you know, what things, if anything, are you seeing slightly differently relative to, you know, circular economy and reuse steels on large scale projects?
Well, I think the point is that contractually we're trying not to. So clients and funders are keen to embrace circular economics, but what we've seen almost invariably is that clients don't want to accept what they would consider to be an unusual apportionment of risk under a contract. So in other words, they don't want to see unusual extensions of time around procurability or program issues. They don't want to see any dilution of the covenants related to design or the quality of the materials. They want all the statutorily implied standards that would apply to still apply, so they don't want any dilution of that. And so I think the only way to achieve that, really, to Luke's point, is to make sure that you've got the early contractor engagement and you've got the right members of the supply chain and you've got a professional team who understand the product, much like mass timber as well. You've got a supply chain who understand the product and what you're dealing with, so that you can effectively unpack the harvesting, defabrication, CE marking, testing process, and you can address the concerns of the supply chain and the contractor, who ultimately, and the professional designers, who ultimately are going to be standing behind the design in the same way as they would if it was a scheme using new steels. So I just think there's an intolerance within the sort of client and funder market. I mean, I don't want to speak for all the clients who are in the audience, but I do sense that, you know, when it comes to the crunch, if reusing steel resulted in a material shift in risk back to the client, I don't think those projects would get traction.
Luke, any kind of further points to kind of add on contracting risk associated with these types of projects?
I think you need to take it on a project by project basis. GP are a client that we know very well. We've worked with them for a long time, and it was one of the sort of things that we looked at when we picked up the tender for Jermyn Street Piccadilly. But when you sort of look into the detail, and we understood, I don't want to repeat what I've already said about the donor project and knowing where things have come from, how developed the model was at the point that we were tendering, gave us comfort that it was going in the right direction and the apportionment of risk changes at the right point in time.
And just out of interest, again, we got our friends from Keltbray and John F. Hunt in the room. You know, obviously, I think we've all done plenty of, you know, demolition projects, you know, with them. Obviously, we always have the ability to kind of contract with them directly and then explore the kind of the benefits of reuse and dismantling, you know, at the front end. From your perspective, you know, is there a kind of a perfect position? You know, would you rather have that, you know, wrapped? I'm sure the answer is probably yes. You know, wrapped under, you know, a MACE, you know, kind of single point of contract, so that you're getting the benefit of a Keltbray and a John F. Hunt's, you know, input to then allow you to better think, you know, downstream about how you could kind of deploy your thinking and design? Is
this for the reuse of the elements within the existing building fabric that we're demolishing?
Yeah.
So that was let directly between GP and John F. Hunt doing the demolition on this project. So that hasn't formed part of our works at the moment. It'll be the post-novation, so post-demolition, those works will be innovated to MACE.
Yeah, but if you were in control, so if MACE were in control, and you were, you know, subcontracting works out to, I'm staring at Holly here, you know, Keltbray or a John F. Hunt's, you know, would you see that to be of more benefit to you from perhaps a commercial position in terms of you having better oversight to what's coming out the building, rather than the latter point innovation piece that you've just described?
So on the reuse point in terms of materials coming out of the existing building, we did a pre-demolition survey and we looked at, throughout stage 3, we looked at anything within the fabric that could be reused. So for example, raised access flooring has come out of the existing building, that will go back into the new one. But I don't think it would change anything in terms of whether the demolition contractor was working underneath MACE or not. You know, we've worked as a team on that piece to try and reuse as much that's come out of the building into the new one.
Yeah.
I think, Rob, it's a question as well of whether or not it's single stage or two stage again. So I think if you've got a two-stage arrangements like you've got on Jermyn Street, then you're usually going to get the client wanting to place the order for the material so that they control the process in case the second stage doesn't work out, and they can novate to their contractor of choice. And I think that it's important in that process that you interrogate the process and that you've had the opportunity to fully understand what you're taking on board. I think if it was single stage, though, you would have to do as you're alluding to, and you would have to have a direct relationship between the contractor and the demo contractor or the stockholder or whoever it is who's supplying. And there would need to be those assurances provided in a shorter timescale based on probably limited due diligence. And I don't know what that would spit out in terms of the allocation of contractual risk. I expect that you would be trying to build in relief into your contract.
I mean, I think that's it, and that's why I think to ask these questions. Obviously, we're always kind of procuring, with obviously kind of cost and time in mind. We want to be making sure that we're kind of all delivering best value for clients, and I think more often than not, as project managers, we might kind of quickly default to go into a kind of a direct, kind of order placement with a Hunts or a Keltbray. But if we feel that we're losing opportunity there by not doing it, for reuse benefit, then again, it's just kind of making sure that that kind of level of feedback and conversation is being had, with the main contracting market to the team, as soon as we can. Just one more point before we kind of start just drifting into some Q&A, and it's going back to the point of pre-demo audit. Okay, so I think Emily at British Land mentioned, lesson learned is just try and get the pre-demo demo audit done as early as possible. That's great. In terms of, a client and a team carrying a pre-demo audit, right from, let's say, the start of stage 2, if we manage to kind of get it in place in time, that travelling with a team up to the point of procurement. Again, from a contracting perspective, Luke, is that something that you just say, yeah, that's great, but we'll do our own anyway, thanks very much. And so the benefit of that early pre-demo audit is then slightly lost at the point of you wanting to gain your own confidence. What's that perception of the pre-demo audit being carried all the way through up to the point that you're introduced to the project?
Yeah, I'd say that. So the pre-demolition audit is done and it sits there, and it then forms part of the stage 3 design. So the materials that we've identified in that schedule then get built into the design. So when we're now sort of going into contract based on stage 4, that's already baked into the stage 4 design. So it will form part of our offer. Is that those materials are there, and that's what's going to go into the building.
Cool. Okay, Laura, John, any other kind of elements on pre-demo audits that you want to add relative to obviously influence of design going into kind of stage 2, stage 3?
I suppose one of the points I'd make, and it's drawing from that, is just because you have the steel taken from an existing building, resist the temptation to say we've got this steel, we better use it in the new building at any cost. Because I alluded to earlier, there is a cost to using reclaimed steel as opposed to, for instance, allowing that steel to be recycled. Recycled steel is, in our experience, a limited material, certainly in the UK European market. And so if you're taking a piece of reclaimed steel and reusing it, then you're also preventing somebody else from using that steel as recycled steel, which means potentially somebody else is then having to procure virgin steel. And there's a piece of work that's been done with the auspices of the IStructD and elsewhere to investigate this in more detail and to understand the global market for recycled steel, which you can appreciate is not clear. But certainly our experience in the UK has been that there is a balance. And the numbers seem to suggest, and the IStructD has published this, that if you're getting utilisations on your reclaimed steel of less than 70%, use a new section. Because it's not a good use of the reclaimed steel, let someone else use it who can use it more effectively, or recycle it, because that tends to be the tipping point between reclaiming it, saving carbon, or go and get a new piece of steel made from recycled steel. And so, relating back to the question where you're doing demo audits, yes, understand what you have in the building, but it may sometimes be better for the sustainability of the industry as a whole to say, actually, we can't effectively, this piece has come out of our building, but we can't effectively use it in our new building. Let's put it into stock. Somebody else will get good use out of it, even if that means we're procuring a piece of new steel. If we're doing that more effectively, using less staff, it may still be the best answer for the climate and for society.
And Laura, I think Will mentioned on the previous conversation about giving consideration to kind of putting better questions or asking better questions in the pre-demo audit. You know, with that in mind, what certain things kind of spring to mind? What aren't we, you know, perhaps looking at or kind of asking hard enough questions for in a pre-demo audit?
Well, I think a pre-demo audit at stage 2, it's all well and good, but there's so much value in the design team wandering around the building before it's been demolished, feasibility, even before anything actually happens, just to identify opportunities. And pre-demo audits are very specific in the information that they provide and the format that they need to be provided in. It's for waste to be managed upon demolition. But we've started using a term like pre-reclamation audits, where you reframe it from demolition to reclamation, and just understanding what's in the structure before it comes down, before anything happens, really starts to make the people designing and the people working on it think about the opportunities before it's been done in a formal manner, because then you can get in and suggest other routes for reclamation, even before anything started on the project.
Good stuff. Okay. I think we're kind of in that territory now where we can start drifting into some questions. So, Steve, if you're happy to flick a few questions up on screen there, we can see if there's ones that we haven't picked up there. This is where I realised I probably should have had an eye test before coming here. So yeah, picking up at the top. So Will's got a question there. So everyone wants to minimise risk, but how do you quantify the risk of not reducing emissions? How is that risk of 3-degree future embedded into decision making? John, is that something you want to try and tackle that one?
I think you would say the fact that we're all here talking about this today is evidence of the fact we have very much taken on board the risk of a 3-degree future. I've seen the papers, looks like something we definitely want to avoid. As an industry, we have key decisions to make, and I think the fact we're taking this seriously, we're turning up, we're engaging this, is evidence that we are taking it seriously. I think I and many others may feel that we're not moving fast enough as an industry, but that's something for us to take away, educate ourselves, and then get moving.
Yourself, any other?
I mean, at the risk of sounding callous and overly commercial, there's a huge commercial imperative as well, obviously, because, you know, if you don't deliver a building that meets occupier demands in terms of embodied carbon and sustainability, it's not going to get traction with the market. It's not going to be saleable and lettable or fundable in the same way as you'd expect. So I think you know, market forces are coalescing to make this happen as well.
Yeah, and I think to enter that, you know, we're seeing, you know, as well as, you know, developers, we're seeing huge kind of, you know, funding and investment constraints, you know, on what we do on the wider kind of sustainability, you know, circular economy piece. So, you know, I think again, it's just kind of so I suppose emphasising sentiment of everybody I think who's spoken today and who I've talked to, that, you know, everybody in this room has the ability to kind of, you know, push this agenda item forward and make it a much kind of, you know, easier and accessible means of, you know, bringing that circular economy conversation point, you know, into every project room, frankly.
And we've got the UK net zero carbon building standard coming out soon as well, which will hopefully help to standardise the approach to sort of measuring embodied carbon and carbon emissions and what that means.
Yeah,
which can only help.
Yeah. Good stuff. There's a good one there from Tom Bunn. Thanks, Tom. Do we fix the materiality of new buildings too soon in the design process? That's an interesting one. Should we allow procurement to have a bigger influence on material selection? Come on, then, Laura. What do you think about that one? Are we going too soon?
I think, speaking from a former sort of project structural engineer, that sounds like a nightmare, because you'd have to just, you know, carry through parallel designs until really late in the game, so, you know, duplicating or triplicating your workload. I mean, it's a good prompt. You know, my gut reaction is like, oof, that's going to make me have to do loads more work. But maybe that's not the right frame of mind. Maybe we should be carrying through sort of way more, you know, like a population of solutions rather than one solution, until the time comes to pull the trigger and procurement happens, and then the final decision is made. I don't know, what do my co-panelists think?
I think if you're to think of a scenario where you don't have a donor building, you've got your design. I think it's about increasing the stock of steel and maybe publicising that stock of steel more, because I don't think I think the right process is to design the building, then try and fit as much reused steel into that. So it's having that universal stock list to see what you can fit at the point in time that you're going to fix it.
Okay, there's it would be remiss of me, Adriano, to not talk about insurance when we've got a lawyer at the panel. So there's a question there about how do insurers view reused steel. I would imagine they're probably much more sympathetic to reused steel perhaps than mass timber, albeit that's developing.
Right, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
They definitely are. And we've had insurers sat on a similar panel in past years as well. What I've seen from the insurance industry is that they're happy with reused steel. There's no particular issues. I mean, you guys can talk about the implications for professional indemnity insurance, but I think in terms of contractual risk policies and buildings insurance policies, I don't see that as being an obstacle here in the same way as it is to mass timber.
Well, a nice tee up there actually, and I'll deviate slightly. So on the PI front, from a designer's perspective, again, I would imagine you're not necessarily being asked to provide, additional PI over than, the typical levels that you'd expect on just a new build vanilla, dare I say it, project. Any thoughts on that?
It's another material. It has certain characteristics which require experience to address correctly and safely, but that's the same as asking for mass timber got mentioned, any number of slightly less common materials, high strength. There's a high strength concrete, there's a whole range of slightly less common materials. The structural engineer needs to know that they have the experience to be able to deal with the particular issues associated with that. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't think reclaimed steel is a particularly challenging one. With a bit of care, a bit of understanding of steel, it's possible to navigate those risks.
Yeah.
There is a question, this is one for the fabricators to address, as to who warrants the steel. And I think it's a bit of a tussle sometimes between the steel reclamation specialists and the fabricators, so who take some of that risk. But I'm not sure if that's being addressed later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just seeing a question down the bottom there. Is it less risky to procure reused steel from a stockist if it has already gone through testing? What's the thought process there?
From a commercial risk perspective, absolutely, you know what you're getting. From a technical risk perspective, if it's not tested and certified, you're going to test it and certify it, and it just means that the risk that you've procured a duff piece of steel now sits with a client who probably isn't very happy about that situation.
How good are we, again, anecdotally speaking, how good are we as an industry at sharing, the potential kind of forthcoming, donor sites? Goes back to that kind of, material bank point. Mm-hmm. I think it was on the last conversation that there was a conversation, I think Will mentioned about donor sites. It's a bit like blood donors. How well do we know our blood type groups in project teams for forthcoming donor sites, and whether, Laura, your project has got something for somebody else's project out there?
I think not well yet. It's all sort of accidental, anecdotal stuff rather than a system that we've built up together. However, the Engineers Reuse Collective that's one of the main aims, is to get different engineers from different companies talking to each other to identify these opportunities way earlier than they would normally. So that's kind of still at a very early stage, but I'm really hopeful that that's going to be it's like doing sort of a backroom deal, but they can be really powerful in these kinds of sharing materials between projects, between companies. So yeah, like I said, I'm quite optimistic about that.
No, good stuff. Sounds like we might almost need a similar group from a kind of a client developer perspective as well. To go even earlier on initial thoughts. Okay, what else have we got? What about procuring future reusable stock instead of just focusing on current stock? Luke, you got any thoughts on that from a procurement perspective?
What about procuring future reusable stock? So, the stock that we've procured, in my experience on this project, the stock that we've used was pre-existing. We've tried to fit the pre-existing stock that we had into the design that we've got, and then we've supplemented it. Future reusable stock. I'm not sure what that
I think that's probably partly a conversation around donor sites. So forthcoming sites that could be reused in the future. So I think we probably partly touched on that.
Or maybe keeping in mind that this new steel we build now will become reused steel stock in the future. So not making the same mistake, learning from what we're struggling through now, and trying to preempt that information without being too onerous. kind of paperwork and information management, but just knowing what we want to know now and really easily building that into the future. It's like when you see an old beam, it's got Dorman and Long stamped on it. You're like, great, I can know exactly who made this, more or less the date. I've got the catalogs of sizes and all that stuff. It makes it really easy. It's just a sort of really old school, almost material passport. So yeah, just understanding what information we need. And what really helps. Things like connection details also are kind of important to understand, because you don't have to break out stuff. You can just kind of look at a drawing and see what connection design forces it was designed to, and then preempting that, I think, in a sensible way is something that we should probably be paying a little bit more attention to. But all that stuff will come from struggling through looking at past stock that's being currently reused, and then just remembering what was tough, and then learning and incorporating that easily for the future. So
with that design in mind, there's a question there about should structurally non-critical sections, shifted down, non-critical sections be designed to a lower grade steel to open up possibilities to reuse the larger stock availability?
So I don't think so. I think this goes back to designing for maximum efficiency first, and then looking at what you can do with the reused stock.
If we're talking about a column, though, you can design this at 460, very efficient, use less steel, reduced overall steel burden on the planet. You don't want to substitute that for a piece of 275, which is then increasing the amount of material we need to extract from the earth, increasing the amount of embodied steel in our structures, because that's driving the wrong outcomes. So, yeah, we want to be able to make substitutions where it makes sense, but we don't want to be driving inefficient design, because that will have perverse effects.
And sorry, just to explain so that we don't go into engineering boring talk too deeply. S275, most of older steel stock is a lower steel grade, so that's why most of the reused stock now is of a lower steel grade. That used to be much more prevalent, but now we design for 355 or 460 because that's what is commonly manufactured now. So we're in a funny situation where you design for a higher grade and then you might have to fit a lower grade into the design. Sometimes that can cause a few kind of redesign issues, but it's not usually an issue, especially if the element is serviceability governed.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to get to kind of final thoughts in a moment. Last quick one there for you, Luke. Do contractors view steel reuse projects as higher risk?
I think there is more risk involved. Again, it comes back to viewing the project on a project by project basis, being involved in that process, leading through it. It enables us to get a bit more comfortable with what the risks are because we've been involved in the project longer. Our program probably does have a little bit more risk using reused steel compared to virgin steel, on the basis that there is that defabrication, refabrication process that could take longer, or that you wouldn't get with new steel. So it is slightly higher, but there's a reason why we're doing it, because I believe it's the right thing to do.
But I think, Robbie, you have to remember that not all contractors are as sophisticated as most of the other tier ones. And some do need the process and the concepts to be socialised to a greater extent, I think. So, this recurrent theme about early contractor involvement is essential, really, especially when you've got a contractor who's new to this.
Good on, so you're going to get a nice, easy ride next time you have a conversation with Mishcon there.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
If I can just clarify the third question down, because it's a common confusion. That's in relation to structural utilisation. So in the iStruct guide, it's formally stated that if the reused, reclaimed section is more than 30% heavier than the efficiently designed section, you shouldn't use a reclaimed section. So, but it's structural utilisation. The stuff that you had to cut off to get it there is immaterial on the basis that's going to get recycled.
Good stuff. Thanks, John. So just closing kind of remarks, really. And I kind of wanted to present this as in the room, we're a new project team. We're sat here with a potential new project. What are the messages that we just want to kind of share with one another? The one takeaway, one thing that you want this project team to kind of think about, get right. So treat it as a lessons learned from past experience. But one thing, John.
I think for me, the biggest thing for us to start thinking about is we have now got the interest in reclaimed steel, we have projects using reclaimed steel, we need to start mapping out how do we get from a cottage industry where we're lovingly reclaiming a few pieces of steel, or we have a donor building and we're carefully designing to reuse that, to a point where we are as an industry using tens of thousands of tonnes or more of reclaimed steel every year. Because if we want to make a real difference, coming back to Will's point about the 3 degrees, if we want to make a real difference to our society, it can't be cottage industry. This needs to be a major part of the global steel supply, which means we need to get serious.
Yeah.
And so what is the pathway for us to do that?
Good sentiment. Laura?
I think from my experience, it's looking back at decisions that were made and asking the people who were involved, like what went wrong, what went right, really drilling down into the learnings from each different time this happens, because I fear that as an industry, we're not that good at looking back and doing a sort of post-mortem. And this is new. It's kind of scary sometimes. It's moving quite quickly as well for the construction industry. And so looking back and really asking questions to learn from every single instance, I think is really important, and I'm going to continue doing that.
And I think to add to that, before Adriano, you answer that, I think there's real promotion and a push cross-industry in holding the mirror up. Mm-hmm. I think obviously that's been, absolutely kind of driven by the events at Grenfell. I think, we've all kind of, looked at our own kind of practices internally and then cross-industry. But I think, our willingness now to share the feedback, share experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, I think we're much more open and collaborative as an industry to help us, push those forward and learn from past experiences. Adriano, go on, get legal again. What do we watch out for?
It's going to sound very self-serving, but involve lawyers early. It's essential. We always add value. No, I think that the point is, we talked a lot about bringing the right team together early in the process. People think of that as being the design team. The contractual piece is really important, and you need to plan that out and think about it, and think about the procurement strategy and how that converts into contract. So you get your clients happy, funders happy, end users. Because that could be, people blame the lawyers for being obstructive. Quite often we're just not involved early enough in the process to make it work. Good stuff. Luke?
It's going to mirror that, really, to be honest. It's about getting reuse on the agenda early in the project. GP displayed a huge amount of foresight in their plan for German Street Piccadilly, and I think we'll see the fruits of that as we continue through the project. Getting the experts on board early, EMR, Elliott Wood, Mace, William Hare, has enabled that process, and I think we're in a much better position for it on this project.
Brilliant, good. Well, my takeaway now is to make sure I've got enough in the budget to cover Adriano's fees. So I'll take that away. Well, thank you all for your participation in the panel. Hopefully everybody's found that informative today. As a typical project manager, I've run slightly over time, so apologies for that. But I think now we'll break for lunch, and thank you all very much. Thanks, everybody.